Hello there and welcome. Tonight I invite you to drift gently with me into the softened shadows of another time, where the tick of the clock was replaced by the toll of bells, where fire warmed more than just the hearth, and where each whisper of the past settles like dust upon old timber beams. Make yourself warm and still, let the outside world hush itself into silence, and allow me to carry you into the world of long ago. Tonight's tale stirs from the simmering pots and smoky kitchens of medieval Europe, a time when food, though meant to nourish, often bewildered the senses with strange textures, curious odours, and puzzling combinations. This is not a tale of banquets and feasts as legends might promise, but one of common meals, bitter realities, and the mysterious reasons why so much of what was eaten in the Middle Ages was, by modern standards, utterly unpleasant. And yet it was all part of life, part of survival, part of the story. So close your eyes, if you will. Let the soft rustle of pages turning guide you, and let us begin. In the small village of Groningham, nestled between low hills and sleepy fields, the hearths burned almost constantly. Every house had one, a deep blackened cavity in the wall from which drifted the smells of the day, wood smoke, sourdough, sometimes meat, more often cabbage. It was a place of toil, warmth, and nourishment. But it was also, as one might gently say, a place where the line between food and survival blurred into something far less appetizing. It was early spring, a time that villagers called the hungry gap. The preserved stores from winter were almost gone, the dried peas brittle as chalk, salted fish crusted with salt so thick it had to be beaten before soaking, and turnips gone soft and translucent. The new crops had not yet come in. What remained in the larders was humble, tired, and very far from fresh. A child named Janet sat on a low stool near her family's hearth, watching as her mother prepared their supper. The pot above the fire swayed slightly with the heat, and from it came the unmistakable scent of something sour and musty. Her mother stirred slowly, the long wooden stained from years of broth and boiling roots. Into the pot went some chopped onion, a pinch of dried nettle, and the last crusts of bread, soaked until they became an indistinct pulp. It was known as pottage, a catch-all stew that simmered for days, replenished with whatever scraps could be spared. Sometimes it contained beans, sometimes barley, sometimes bones already boiled twice. But what it never contained, not truly, was freshness. Nothing crisp, nothing bright, and certainly nothing sweet. Janet's face wrinkled at the aroma, but she said nothing. Children did not complain about food, not in a place where meals were sacred through their very scarcity. Her mother, thick with weariness, turned and offered a thin smile. "Be grateful, little one," she said. "It's better than some have." Indeed, she was right. Food was not always guaranteed in Groningham. Bad harvests, mouldy grain, and taxes could all conspire to empty a pantry. Even when food was plentiful, it was not often pleasant. Grains were ground roughly between stones, often leaving flecks of grit that wore down teeth. Flour turned dark quickly, infested with beetles. Ale, safer to drink than water, was sour and flat. And then there was meat, a luxury for the poor, a risk for the wealthy. Preservation was a constant concern. Without refrigeration, food had to be salted, dried, smoked, or pickled. These methods preserved the edible parts, yes, but they altered the taste beyond recognition. Salted pork was so hard it needed to be boiled for hours. Fish, cured until leathery, bore the scent of the sea long past its departure from it. Cheese, often made from goat or ewe's milk, was dense and crumbly and sometimes speckled with the blue-green veins of a mould that might or might not have been deliberate. Spices. Now there was a treasure, but not for the reasons one might think. Pepper, cloves and nutmeg were traded at high cost and often used not to season but to mask. They covered the flavour of slightly off meats or fermented sauces, transforming them into something palatable. But only the rich could afford them, and so the poor relied on native herbs, wild garlic, mustard seeds, and pungent horseradish. In the manor house at the edge of the village, Lady Adelinde dined on a different fare. Her table was dressed with trencher bread, thick slices used as plates, upon which rested slices of mutton, stewed plums, and pies filled with everything from pigeon to eels. Yet even her meals were far from what one might consider gourmet. The meat was often overcooked to kill off the beginnings of rot. Sauces were heavily spiced, sweetened with honey or dried fruits to disguise sourness. The pies? They were sealed with lard and left unrefrigerated for days. There was no such thing as balance, no colourful plate with vegetables on one side and grains on the other. Meals were a reflection of availability, not desire. What grew well was eaten often. What lasted longest became the staple. The result was monotony at best, nausea at worst. Still, there was comfort in routine. A pot bubbling over the fire meant security. Bread rising slowly in the warmth of an oven stone meant tomorrow would come. Even the worst-smelling cheese, the sharpest ale, or the hardest biscuit had its place. Janet's mother ladled the pottage into small wooden bowls and handed one to her. Janet cradled it, its warmth seeping into her fingers. The steam carried the scent of onions, sour bread, and something vaguely green. She took a tentative sip. It was bland, but it was filling. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the mingled smells of other hearths, of broth and fish and boiled leeks. Across the village, in countless homes, families gathered around meals that shared a single truth. Food was not made for pleasure, it was made for endurance, and in that shared reality, a kind of community grew. The night settled deeper. The fire crackled softly. The wooden spoon rested against the edge of the pot, and in the quiet, the story of medieval food, strange, sour, and steadfast, began to unfold. The days grew a little longer, and the spring rains began to soften the hard clumps of earth in the fields beyond Groningham. Yet within the homes of the villagers, the meals remained the same, rooted in sameness, in repetition, in survival. The seasons moved slowly, and so too did the changes on the supper table. In the early light, before the bells rang out from the small stone chapel on the hill, the baker's apprentice, a lank boy named Toon, stirred from his hay-stuffed cot. His arms were always dusted with flour, and his hands bore the small burns of an open oven's breath. The bakery was not large, but its oven was one of the few in the village, and from it came the dense, coarse loaves that sustained the people day after day. Toon rose before the cocks, slipping into the low-ceilinged bakehouse where the smell of old dough and yeast hung thick. He worked the leaven with care, a mixture of flour, water, and wild fermentation that was never thrown out, only fed and reused. This sourdough starter, called barm, was the heart of the bread, though it carried with it a tang that some found too sharp, too sour, especially when the dough was left to ferment too long. The flour, milled from rye and barley, had a dark hue and a gritty texture. Between his fingers, Toon could feel the groundstone, minute flecks from the millstones, harmless to the hands, but slowly destructive to the teeth of those who chewed the bread daily. Still, it was what they had. White flour, fine and soft, was for the nobility, imported and rare. The villagers ate what their fields could yield. As the fire roared to life and the loaves were set to bake, the village began to stir. Outside, in a narrow hut near the stream, a fisherman named Old Martin hauled his catch onto a splintered bench. The fish, mostly river trout, eels and the occasional carp, still glistened, though some had already stiffened. He gutted them by lantern light, careful not to waste even the smallest scrap. The clean water of the stream was not trusted for drinking. It was filled with runoff from the nearby pastures, and the risk of sickness lingered in every cup. Ale was preferred, weak but safer, brewed in small households across the village. Children drank it. So did the sick and the elderly. Boiling removed the danger, and so the water was transformed into something darker, yeastier, and more familiar. On feast days or after a lucky catch, Martin would smoke his fish using alder wood. The smoke curled in blue spirals from his little shack, settling into the flesh of the fish, giving it an acrid, heavy flavour. Some liked it, others tolerated it. It was never about preference. It was always about keeping hunger at bay. Back in the manor house, the kitchens were more elaborate, though still distant from what one might call fine. The cook, a broad woman named Berth, oversaw the roasting of a swan, a bird caught in the Lord's marshy ponds. Its feathers had been plucked the day before, its skin singed to remove the last quills. But the flesh itself had already begun to turn, tinged with a sweetness that betrayed its age. Berth had a trick for this. She would soak the meat in vinegar, then dress it with a paste of cinnamon, cloves and black pepper, spices that came by way of the traders who passed through Bruges and Ghent, and into the hands of those who could afford them. The result was something oddly fragrant, yet still heavy with decay. To the guests at the table, it might pass as exotic, but to Berthe, it was simply camouflage. Sauces were often the key to masking the truth of what was served. Many were made with wine that had turned sour, or ale that had gone flat. Into these were stirred breadcrumbs, dried fruit, or crushed nuts. The sweet and sour flavour was prized, partly for its novelty, but also because it allowed even questionable meats to be consumed without suspicion. Meanwhile, in the monastery beyond the far fields, the brothers broke their fast with simplicity. Porridge, often made from oats or spelt, bubbled thickly in clay pots. Sweetened only by the occasional dried apple or bit of honeycomb, it was bland but filling. On Fridays and during fasting days, of which there were many, they avoided meat entirely. Fish, eggs and dairy were permitted in some interpretations of the rule, but many monks lived for long stretches on bread, ale and porridge alone. One novice brother kept a journal in his cramped quarters. His script was neat, his lines tight. He wrote not of divine visions or grand theological debates, but of food, the monotony of it, the texture, the small pleasures when a new herb was added or when the porridge came with stewed onions. His words were not complaints. They were observations, quiet acknowledgements of the rhythm that life in the cloister demanded. Outside the monastery, across the worn footpaths and hedgerows, peasants gleaned what they could from the land. Wild herbs such as sorrel, dandelion and yarrow were gathered to add to stews. Roots were dug, even when worm-eaten, and mushrooms were taken with cautious reverence. The wrong one could mean death. Preservation continued to dominate their thoughts. In warm weather, food spoiled quickly. Milk turned sour within a day. Meat had to be hung, salted or buried in ash. Some families buried whole cabbages in earthen pits, returning weeks later to retrieve something soft, acidic and still edible, if barely. There was a saying in Groningham, better bitter than none at all. It was not said with sarcasm but with sincerity. To eat something was to live another day. The flavours, however disagreeable, were secondary. Children were taught not to gag. They were taught to chew slowly, to be thankful, and never to waste. The dogs, thin and quiet, waited under tables, not for scraps but for bones, dry and bare, which they would gnaw until nothing remained. At night the air hung heavy with the mingled smells of boiling pots, sour milk, smoked fish, and damp grain. It was not unpleasant to those who lived within it. It was simply life, the scent of survival. And yet beneath the routines and the customs, beneath the patience and the plainness, there lingered the faintest yearning for something fresh, something sweet, something crisp. A dream, perhaps, of a pear straight from the tree, or a loaf of bread with no bitterness, no grit. Dreams that would come only rarely and always at a price. The following weeks brought warmer breezes to Groningham, and with them the first signs of green. Young shoots emerged from the tilled fields, and the hedgerows began to bud. Hope stirred, faint but persistent. Yet even in these moments of renewal, the meals on the hearth remained humble, simple, repetitive, and bound by old traditions and older fears. In the shadow of the village chapel, an old woman named Lisbeth lived alone. Her fingers were bent like the branches of the gnarled hawthorn trees outside her door, and her eyes held the quiet knowledge of many winters. Each morning, she shuffled to the edge of the woods with a basket and a short-bladed knife, gathering what the earth offered freely. She was an herb woman, respected in her quiet way, though some children whispered of spells and mutterings. She knew where wild garlic grew strongest, where the bedstraw curled in shady clumps, and where violets bloomed near clearings untouched by livestock. Lisbeth's food rarely resembled the village norm. She foraged more than she farmed, her meals thick with greens, sharp with nettles, and flecked with petals when the season allowed. But her home was not fragrant. Her hearth did not sing with sweet scents. A pot of boiled dandelion greens seasoned with a twist of ground dock root gave off an odour that clung to the rafters like smoke. Her bread, made with acorn flour when grain was scarce, tasted bitter unless leached for days in running water. Yet she ate and lived and did not complain. The bitterness was more than a flavour. It was a companion. It reminded her and others like her that food was never meant to be agreeable. It was meant to serve a purpose, to nourish the body and quiet the pangs in the belly. Any joy it brought was incidental. Across the way, the blacksmith's wife, Rochi, prepared a dish passed down from her grandmother. Boiled onions and leeks, thickened with oatmeal, and stirred until it resembled paste. It was called slop by some, though no one would admit that aloud. Served with hard cheese, often speckled with blue mould, but scraped and eaten nonetheless, it formed the entirety of the evening meal. Roach's children asked if there might be apples, or perhaps honey, and she smiled as she shook her head. The apples from last autumn were long gone and honey was dear. Most of it belonged to the abbey hives, and only a portion ever reached the common folk, usually as part of a remedy, not a treat. In the manor house above the village, the Lord's steward dealt with his own problems. A shipment of wine from the south had soured in the barrel and the cook refused to serve it. It was cloudy and sharp with a smell of wet wool. But the steward, ever practical, suggested using it for sauce or for soaking stale bread to make a kind of pudding, sweetened with raisins and sweet herbs to disguise the tang. Wine was rarely wasted, even when it turned, and the line between drinkable and not was a thin one. Often what passed for wine in a noble's cup was halfway to vinegar, especially by spring. The poor drank ale, the rich drank aged grape. But both chased away thirst with liquids whose flavours bore little resemblance to anything refreshing. At the monastery, Brother Elric copied recipes from older manuscripts, fascinated by the methods of those long gone. One parchment described a mortruse, a dish of ground meat, breadcrumbs, almond milk and spices, boiled into a paste and served cold. Elric had tasted it once on the feast day of St. Bavo. It had been heavy, greasy and oddly sweet. And yet everyone ate it reverently, savouring its richness. He noted too the contradictions in the old texts. How one remedy for an upset stomach involved boiled cabbage while another warned against it. How onions were said to be both healing and dangerous. How garlic, so common in peasant homes, was avoided by some monks who believed it stirred the blood too fiercely. The knowledge of food was passed down not through clarity but through habit. Mothers taught daughters how to test if meat had turned, by touch, by smell, by watching for the glisten of oil where there should be none. Cooks learned to identify the right moment to add barley, or when a pottage needed ashes to thicken it. Nothing was measured. Everything was judged by eye, by feel, by memory. In times of greater hunger, a failed crop, a cold spring, a sudden illness, people turned to desperation. Bark from linden trees could be scraped, dried, and ground to mix with flour. Cats and dogs disappeared. Frogs and snails became part of the pot. There were stories, whispered in shame, of worse things still, but such things were not spoken openly. One did not name the darkest meals unless the need was upon them. In daily life, there was enough to bear. Even the village priest who held the power of Latin and the rituals of the church ate simply. His supper was often dried peas, crushed and boiled with a bit of pork fat when it could be spared. On fast days, he ate only boiled millet, which stuck to the bowl in a way that had to be scraped clean with a knife. He offered grace before each meal, but never asked for flavour, only for sustenance. Flavour, after all, was an indulgence. One reserved it for weddings, for the birth of a child, or for the harvest festival when the Lord might offer a feast. Then, perhaps, there would be roast goose, candied nuts, or spiced wine thick with cinnamon. But those were fleeting. They came and went like stars behind clouds. In the daily rhythm of life, food was ritual without pleasure. The same grains, the same herbs, the same broths, a mouthful of onion, a sip of thin ale, a chew of dense bread. This was the cadence of survival. And yet, there was an odd comfort in it. The familiarity, the predictability. In a world full of uncertainties, weather, illness, war, death, the bowl of pottage was something one could count on. Even when it tasted of little, even when it turned the stomach, it meant one thing very clearly: not today. Today we eat. Today we live. The scent of spring earth drifted through the open shutters of Gruningham's cottages. It was the scent of damp soil, awakening roots, and distant blossoms. Yet for most in the village, the smells that truly defined the season came from their own hearths, from what simmered in the pot or crackled on the panstone. The contrast between nature's renewal and the meagre persistence of their food was sharp but familiar. In a narrow stone house near the edge of the woods, a family of co-opers prepared their midday meal. Their trade involved the shaping of barrels and tubs, essential items in a world where preservation mattered more than presentation. Fermentation and salting were impossible without their handiwork. And yet, despite the vital nature of their work, their table was as humble as any. The father, Hubrecht, had salted a rabbit snared in the hedgerow weeks earlier. It had hung for days in a cold corner of the house, its flesh drawn tight, its bones hardened. That morning, he submerged it in water to draw out some of the salt, but even after hours of soaking and boiling, the meat remained tough and carried a sharp metallic tang. His wife, Laure, added wild sorrel to the pot, hoping the sour leaves would cut through the brine. She also dropped in a few crushed garlic cloves and a handful of dried chickpeas, small, hard things that required hours to soften, if they softened at all. Their son, Allard, sat near the hearth, watching the liquid bubble and swirl, hypnotised by the slow rise of steam. When the rabbit was finally served, it flaked apart with effort, its fibres stubborn. The sorrel had turned the broth greenish-grey, and the garlic left a lingering bitterness. Yet they ate without protest. To chew was to live, and to live one did not need delight, only enough. At the same hour in the village square, the tanner's apprentices huddled near their master's workshop, sharing a meal wrapped in a cloth. It was a barley cake, thick and damp, flavoured only with ground mustard seeds and a trace of pork fat scraped from a pot days earlier. The cake had been fried on a slate, then left to cool and harden. Its edges cracked as they bit into it, and the centre was dense, almost gluey. Still, they shared it in silence, tearing small pieces and chewing slowly. The air around them stank of urine and lime, ingredients used in softening hides. The smell clung to their clothes, their hair, their breath. It made their food seem even less inviting, yet none seemed to notice. They were accustomed. Food and filth were neighbours in daily life. In the castle kitchens, the staff prepared for a visiting noble, a cousin to Lord Reynold. This was a rare event, and so Berth, the cook, had ordered the preparation of an elaborate pie. The pastry was thick and lardy, rolled out on a rough table. The filling was more questionable: minced liver, eggs, parsley, dried prunes and mace. Each item had been chosen with care, not for harmony, but for strength. Strong flavours hid faults. Strong spices masked decay. As the pie baked in the tall hearth, it released an aroma that was strangely sweet and meaty. To those in the kitchen, it was a success. To modern sensibilities, it might have seemed a warning. But in a time when refrigeration was a fantasy and waste a sin, such combinations were not only common, they were praised. In the nearby village of Leerbeek, a market was held that day. Merchants from outlying hamlets brought their wares: salted herring, wheels of sharp-smelling cheese, dark loaves wrapped in cloth, and dried apples tough as leather. A butcher displayed tripe, pig's feet, and blood sausages. Flies gathered quickly, but were waved away with bundles of mint or by the sweep of aprons. A boy from Groningen, sent with a few coins in a small basket, lingered near the booth of a spice seller. He gazed at tiny jars of cinnamon, cumin, ginger, and dried orange peel. The scents were intoxicating, warm, heady, unlike anything from home. But the prices were high, and the boy turned instead to buy vinegar and a cone of coarse salt. He passed by a man selling smoked lampreys, a delicacy to some, a horror to others. Their slick, eyeless bodies had been hung and charred over a fire until they curled like ribbons. Few could afford them. Fewer still wanted to. That night in Groningen, meals were taken quietly. The sun had warmed the earth, but not yet the crops. No fresh vegetables had reached the table. No milk could be spared for cream. The cow had calved, and her milk was thinned for the baby first. Butter, once churned every few days, was now rare. Instead, villagers used lard or drippings, greasy remnants from meat cooked long ago. These were smeared on bread or melted into porridge or spread on onions to fry them until black at the edges. Flavour came not from delicacy, but from fat, from smoke, from time. Janet, now a little older, sat with her mother again by the fire. The pot held pottage as usual, but tonight a few green shoots of spring onion floated on the surface. Her mother had gathered them near the field's edge. They added a brightness to the scent, a sharpness that felt, just barely, like a promise. Janet ate slowly. The bread was hard and dry, but the onions were soft and warm. It was not delicious, but it was different, and different in a life of sameness could be a kind of joy. Across the village, Shutters were closed, fires banked low, stomachs, if not full, were quiet, and in the gentle quiet of evening the people of Groningham prepared to sleep, their bodies fed, if not satisfied, their minds resting, if not dreaming. The spring deepened, and with it the colour of the fields began to shift from brown to mottled green. New leaves unfurled timidly, and the soft hum of bees began to return to the air. In Groningham, this awakening was met with cautious gratitude, a sense that the world was loosening its grip on hardship, if only slightly. But for now, the meals remained what they had always been, reflections not of abundance, but of endurance. In a small cottage just beyond the village's southern path, a weaver named Jenut prepared supper for her family. She had no husband, only her father and her 2 sons, all lean with labour. Her loom stood near the hearth, where her threads hung in tidy bundles. As she worked, a pot simmered beside her, the wooden spoon resting in a groove worn into the edge of the hearthstone. The meal was barley porridge, thickened with cabbage leaves and seasoned with little more than salt and a whisper of marjoram. A smoked pig's tail, hung near the rafters since late winter, was dropped into the pot for richness. It was not meant to be eaten, only to impart its flavour. The tail would be pulled out before serving, set aside, and returned again the next night. This was common practice, a kind of borrowed richness, used again and again until it gave no more. Janut's eldest son, Anselm, asked if there might be milk to add to the porridge. She shook her head gently. "Tomorrow," she murmured, though she knew it might be longer. The cow in the shared pasture had taken ill, and milk was now divided among 3 households. Each received a portion, thin, warm, and faintly sour, if not used quickly. In the village centre, 2 men argued quietly over bread. The baker, Toyn's master, insisted that the flour had been weighed correctly, but the customer, a carpenter's apprentice, held up a loaf and pointed to the centre, hollow as though collapsed during baking. The bread was dense at the bottom, yet soft and airy at the top, the result of uneven leavening. Still, it would be eaten. There was no question of waste. Most loaves were mixed with bran, husks, or even ground beans to stretch the flour. This added bulk, but also changed the taste. The bread was dark, sour, and gritty, and yet it filled the belly. A bad loaf was better than none at all. Elsewhere in Groningham, an old man named Oswald prepared a dish from his youth, a kind of thick soup known as gruel, made from crushed rye, onions, and boiled nettles. He stirred it slowly, seated on a 3-legged stool. His fire was small, barely more than coals, but it gave enough heat to warm the pot. Oswald had no teeth left. He had worn them down long ago on coarse bread and unclean grain. Now all his meals were soft, spooned slowly, and taken with great care. He seasoned his food with vinegar, which he made from wild apples fermented in a clay jar beside the hearth. The vinegar was cloudy and sharp, but he prized it. It masked the taste of spoilage and brought a semblance of brightness to otherwise lifeless meals. In the manor, the kitchens were livelier than usual. The visiting noble, Lady Isabel of Alost, had extended her stay. To accommodate her, the staff had begun preparing multiple courses, not out of generosity, but to maintain appearances. Berth, the head cook, directed her assistants with precision. They roasted pigeons on a spit, turned slowly over flames. The birds had been caught only 2 days before and hung to tenderize in the cellar. This was common among the gentry, the belief that meat slightly aged was more flavourful. To the kitchen servants, the smell was foul, thick and sweet. But they followed orders. The pigeons were basted in vergis, a sour juice made from unripe grapes, and sprinkled with powdered ginger and long pepper. Alongside the pigeons, a dish of turnips was prepared. They were boiled, mashed and beaten with oil and breadcrumbs, then baked into small patties. The flavour was earthy and bitter, but they were served with a sauce made of wine, vinegar and crushed raisins, giving them an almost cloying sweetness. Sweet and sour were fashionable among nobles, not for pleasure but for show. The servants ate later from the scraps. Bits of pigeon flesh pulled from the bone, the ends of the turnip patties, the crusts of bread soaked in gravy. It was better than their usual fare, but only just, and even these scraps were sometimes fought over, quietly, bitterly. Near the monastery, Brother Elric worked in the herb garden. He plucked sage and feverfew, sniffing each before laying them in his basket. These were for medicine, but he sometimes slipped a few leaves into the kitchens where the monks cooked simple dishes in silence. Tonight, the brethren would eat lentils, boiled soft and served with leeks. The pot had simmered since dawn, thick and brown. A single bay leaf floated on top. They had no meat today, a fast was upon them. But they had ale, weak and cloudy, and bread made from oats. It was not pleasing, but it nourished. In a cell not far from the chapel, an older monk recalled a time, decades before, when a feast had been held at the monastery. He remembered dishes thick with spice, jellied fish in moulded shapes, and birds served whole with gilded feathers. The memory was faint, almost dreamlike. He had not tasted such things in years. His life now was one of humility, and his meals reflected that. But even the poor dreamed. Even the simplest heart remembered sweetness, salt, and warmth. Not often, and never aloud, but always, somewhere beneath the quiet. In Groningham, the night crept in once more. The fields slept, the fires dimmed, and the scent of boiled barley, burnt onions, and old cabbage lingered in the air. It was not a scent of hunger, nor of abundance, but something in between. A smell of getting by, of making do, of surviving one more day. As summer's breath whispered across the fields of Groningham, the village stirred with the first signs of real change. The soil had warmed, the early crops pushed upwards, and the air began to smell faintly of green things, growing, stretching, swelling with promise. But the people did not rejoice yet. They knew better. A late frost, a sudden blight, or too little rain could undo everything. So they waited and watched and ate what remained from last season. In a quiet corner near the hedgerow, a widow named Mechthild sat cross-legged on a patch of grass, sorting through a bundle of dried beans. Each bean was examined carefully. Chipped ones were discarded, mouldy ones set aside for planting, the best chosen for boiling. She had no fire yet. The wood had been slow to dry this year, and she hated to burn it too early in the day. Instead, she would soak the beans in water and leave them in the sun to soften. A slow process, but one that cost nothing. Her meal that day would be bean mash, eaten cold, with a drizzle of hemp oil and crushed fennel seeds. It was not satisfying, but it was enough. Mechthild had grown used to this quiet hunger, a low ache that never left but never shouted either. Near the village's edge, a small group of children darted through the tall grasses, chasing dragonflies and picking young nettles with care. The youngest, a girl with flaxen hair, carried a cloth bag tied at the waist. Inside were wild greens, nettles, chickweed, sorrel and goosefoot. These would be brought home, washed, boiled and stirred into whatever stew their mothers had started that morning. The greens softened the colour of the pottage and gave it a bitterness that some learned to love, or at least to tolerate. At midday, the bell rang from the chapel tower and smoke began to curl once more from the chimneys. Janet and her mother prepared their simple meal, seated near their hearth as usual. Today they had a bit of barley to spare, so they ground it roughly with a stone and mixed it with water and a handful of dried currants, wrinkled and tart from the last merchant's visit. The mixture was baked on a hot slate until crisp at the edges. It smelled faintly sweet, though it was more sour than anything else. Janet bit into hers carefully. The currants, when bitten, released a burst of sharpness that startled her. She smiled a little. It was the closest thing to fruit tasted in weeks. Meanwhile, the tanner's wife, Isken, was making a kind of meat paste called hash, though meat was perhaps a generous word. It was made from scraps, skin, gristle, fat, and the ends of tougher cuts boiled until they surrendered. She minced them with onions and stale bread, then fried the mixture in tallow until it formed a dark, crusty mass. The smell was strong, clinging to the walls, the air, the hands. Her husband liked it. Her children less so. It was a dish born of necessity, an attempt to capture flavour where none remained. The tallow spat and hissed on the iron pan, sending up wisps of smoke that curled toward the low beams overhead. When the hash was done, it was left to cool, then sliced and served with thin beer. The texture was odd, somewhere between pudding and meat. The flavour was greasy and intense. At the manor, Lady Isabel's visit had come to an end, and with her departure, the kitchen staff sighed in relief. The constant demands for elaborate sauces and moulded pastries had worn them thin. Berth, the cook, now turned her attention to preserving what remained. She directed 2 boys to pit the early cherries which had arrived from a neighbouring estate. The cherries were sour and small, their juice staining the boys' fingers deep red. They were boiled with wine and honey, what little remained, then poured into stoneware jars and sealed with wax. Preserves were not common in Groningen. Honey was scarce and sugar nearly mythical, but for those in the manor a few jars could be spared. They would be brought out at Christmastide, served with spiced meats or on wafers during feast days. Until then they would sit in the cellar's cool darkness waiting. Brother Elric, in his study at the monastery, examined an old herbal text by candlelight. It described electuary, a preparation of medicinal herbs mixed with honey and dried fruit, pressed into small balls. These were used not just for health, but for flavour, a kind of sweetmeat for the ailing and the noble. Elric considered trying it, using local ingredients. He had dried mint, crushed rose petals, and a few slices of pear left from a rare offering. He mashed them with honey, shaped the mixture, and left it to set. When he tasted one that evening, he was surprised. It was sweet, certainly, but more than that, it was complex. The rose lingered, the mint cooled the tongue, the pear added a faint sourness. For a moment, he was overwhelmed. It felt like a glimpse of another world, a better one. He made the sign of the cross and returned to his scribing. Elsewhere in the village, 2 boys roasted a hedgehog over a fire. It had been caught near the woods, and though not everyone ate them, the boys' family did. After singing off the spines, the animal was wrapped in clay and set in the coals. When the clay hardened and cracked, it pulled away the last of the quills, revealing flesh beneath. The meat was soft and fatty, not unpleasant, but it left a strange film in the mouth, and its smell lingered on the fingers for days. Food in Groningen was always like this, a push and pull between need and invention, between tradition and chance. No 2 meals were exactly the same, and yet they all carried the same weight, the need to nourish, however clumsily, however grimly. As the sun lowered behind the distant hills and the fields darkened, the people of the village settled in once again. Fires flickered to life, pots were stirred, bread was broken. In each cottage, in each corner of stone and wood, the scent of evening meals rose up, of herbs, of grain, of smoke, of survival. Not one was a feast, but every meal in its quiet way was a triumph over hunger. The longest days of the year arrived gently, unnoticed by those too busy to mark the sun's journey across the sky. Summer in Groningen was not a time of rest but of constant motion, fields to tend, wood to gather, food to secure. With each passing day, the village's meals became a little more varied, though not necessarily more palatable. The landscape bloomed, but the table remained humble. In the early morning haze, Hubrecht the co-opper stood barefoot at the edge of his garden, inspecting the heads of cabbage. Their outer leaves bore holes from insects, and the soil was cracked with thirst, but they were growing. It would be weeks yet before they were large enough to harvest, but already his wife Law was planning. One would be sliced and salted, packed into a barrel to ferment. Another would be boiled until soft, then served with barley mash. A third might be roasted, if they could spare the fuel. But for now there were only the young leaves, bitter, rubbery and faintly metallic. Law boiled a handful that morning, mixing them with dried onions and a few sprigs of thyme. The smell was harsh, almost medicinal, but it filled the kitchen and gave the illusion of richness. It was served with hard bread soaked in thin ale, the crust softened just enough to chew. In the baker's house, Toon laboured over a new batch of dough. The air was thick with yeast and ash. The bread had become increasingly sour as summer progressed, the balm fermenting too quickly in the heat, bubbling and foaming beyond control. The loaves were edible, but only just. Toon sliced a piece for himself, chewing slowly. The crust was dense and the inside gummy with a sharp tang that puckered the mouth. Still, it settled his stomach. At the manor, the steward had commissioned a meal to celebrate the feast of St. Peter. Berth, though tired from the heat, set about creating a dish known as blancmanger. It was made from shred chicken breast, almond milk and rice, boiled into a soft pale paste and sweetened with sugar, a rare indulgence kept locked in a tin box. The result was delicate, bland and rich all at once. It was meant to calm the stomach, a luxury for those who had never known true hunger. The leftover bones were thrown into a pot with onions, garlic and herbs to make broth for the servants. They drank it from wooden cups, dipping stale bread until it dissolved into mush. It was a good day when there was meat in the broth, even if only in trace. Down by the stream, old Martin the fisherman had laid out his catch. River bream, silver and dull-eyed, wrapped in wet cloth to keep them cool. He had no salt left for curing, so the fish were gutted and hung to dry in the sun. The smell was strong and sharp, drawing flies and neighbours alike. The dried fish would be boiled later, the flesh flaking away from bones with little resistance. It tasted like the river, muddy, sour, but sustaining. That evening, Martin offered a piece to Janet's family as thanks for mending his net. Her mother accepted it with a quiet nod and no words. She boiled it with wild leeks and turnip tops, the broth cloudy and green. It was a better meal than usual, and Janet ate slowly, savouring the texture of the fish despite its bitterness. Elsewhere, the village children gathered around a travelling peddler. He had arrived with a cart of oddities: tin buttons, coloured thread, a few iron nails, and dried pears wrapped in linen. The fruit was leathery and dark. Its sweetness faded, but to the children it was treasure. One boy traded a chicken feather and 2 smooth stones for a slice, which he shared carefully with his sister. They ate it in the shade of the chapel wall, sticky-fingered and smiling. In the monastery, the brethren observed their midday silence with bowls of cold pea soup. It was thick and green, seasoned only with a pinch of salt. Brother Elric sipped his slowly, his mind adrift. He had begun compiling a list, not of saints or miracles, but of meals. He wrote them down in neat script along with their ingredients and their effects. Boiled beans with fennel, good for the bowels but causes wind. Leeks with milk, soothing, though causes sleepiness. Cold fish, sour taste, lasts 1 day at best. He wrote without judgment. He knew that food, no matter how poor, was holy in its own way. It sustained the body, and through the body the soul. Even the worst of meals had its place. That night, in the blacksmith's home, Rocha prepared a treat for her husband. She had found a handful of caraway seeds left in a jar. She mixed them with oats and suet, forming small cakes that she fried on the stone beside the fire. They crisped and bubbled, the seeds releasing their strange, spicy aroma. When they were done, she served them warm, drizzled with a spoonful of honey borrowed from a neighbour. The sweetness was fleeting, the spice lingering. Her husband, soot-faced and bone-weary, ate in silence. Then with a grunt, he nodded. She took it as thanks. In every home, the meals told the same story. Of effort, of adaptation, of scraping together what the land, the season and fortune allowed. Even in abundance, there was restraint. Even in warmth, a chill of caution. And so, as the day closed and the breeze cooled, Groningham settled again into quiet. Bellies were not full, but they were quiet. Fires burned low, dishes were wiped with crusts of bread, fingers licked and pots scraped clean. It was enough. It had to be. August arrived with heat thick as wool, and a silence that stretched between the fields and the forest edge. The air was heavy with dust, stirred only by the wings of insects and the passing of oxen pulling carts of hay. In Groningham, the earth had turned golden, but the harvest was still weeks away. Everything was nearly ripe, nearly ready, but not yet. And so the people waited, mouths dry, pantries low, hearts patient. In the corner of the village, Mechtild the widow had taken to drying nettles. She hung them upside down in bundles from the rafters, where the air was hottest. Once crisp, she would crumble the leaves into clay jars, using them to season winter meals. Nettles were bitter, yes, but rich with what her body needed, or so the herbalist told her. She had little reason to doubt it. She had eaten them for decades and was still standing. Her midday meal was a kind of soup, if it could be called that. It was water thickened with rye flour and seasoned with dried dill. Into it, she dropped a piece of dried mushroom she had saved since spring. It softened slowly, releasing an earthy smell. The soup had the colour of old parchment and the consistency of thin glue, but it was warm and it filled her. Elsewhere, Janet's mother was preparing something slightly more festive. A neighbouring household had slaughtered a chicken and the feet had been offered to her as a gift. She accepted them with thanks and careful hands. The feet were cleaned, boiled and scraped. The resulting broth was sticky and rich with gelatin. Into it she dropped barley, parsley and a single clove of garlic. Janet watched as the claws curled in the heat, their knobby joints rising above the surface like small gnarled roots. When served, the meat was minimal, scraps, tendons, skin. But the broth was flavourful, dense, and savoury. It clung to the lips. It was, by Groningham standards, luxurious. Across the dusty village square, the tanner's apprentices sat on barrels, chewing on bread soaked in beer. The beer was nearly flat, and the bread had a sour tang that curled their tongues. It was made with bran and peas, ground together and barely leavened. The crust was so tough they had to suck on it before biting, but the meal did its job. It stilled the hunger and left little mess. Not far from them, a swineherd roasted a marrow bone over a small fire. He had scavenged it from a carcass a day earlier and cracked it open with a hammer. As the fat inside melted, he caught it in a piece of bread, letting it drip slowly until the crust was translucent. He ate with reverence, licking the grease from his fingers. Such richness was rare, and he wasted none of it. In the manor house, Berth had begun fermenting plums. The fruit, small and sharp, was packed into jars with vinegar and salt. In a month, they would be served alongside roasted meat to cut through the grease. The process was simple but fussy. Jars had to be sealed tightly, the liquid stirred now and then, mould scraped from the top if it formed. Fermentation was not a trend but a necessity. Without it, nothing lasted. Even in the Lord's house, where food was better and more plentiful, preservation was a daily concern. The cellar was lined with shelves of pickled onions, brined beans and salted fish. Each jar marked a hedge against winter. Lady Isabel, though long departed, had left behind a craving for what she called delicate fare. At her request, Berth had once made a jelly from calf's feet, clarified with egg whites and flavoured with rosewater. It had taken 2 days to prepare. No one asked for it since. At the monastery, Brother Elric had begun drying apples. He sliced them thinly and laid them on wooden boards beneath the cloister's open eaves. The sun did its slow work, turning the flesh leathery and golden. Once dry, they would be stored in sacks and steeped later in wine or water for sweet dishes. Apples, even dried, were treasured. They were one of the few things that grew sweet from the ground. That evening, they shared a piece with an elder brother, who took it in trembling fingers and closed his eyes as he chewed. "Tastes like sunlight," he whispered. Elric smiled but said nothing. In the blacksmith's home, Roche tried her hand at a dish she hadn't made since her wedding, barley pudding. She boiled the grain in almond milk, borrowed from the manor's kitchens, and added a bit of ground ginger saved in a cloth pouch. It was rare to have both spice and milk. The pudding thickened slowly, the scent rising like a memory. When served, it was warm, sweet, and nutty. Her children stared in disbelief. She served it in silence. There was no ceremony, no celebration. Just a quiet nod. But in her chest, something lifted. Outside, the air was thick with dust and the hum of bees. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across fields not yet harvested. The grain waved softly in the breeze, not ready but nearly there. In Groningham, pots were emptied, crumbs wiped, bowls scraped clean. Each mouthful, whether sweet or sour, bitter or bland, was received with the same quiet gratitude, not for the taste, but for the promise it held. That hunger had not won, that tomorrow was still theirs. The harvest came at last, not with trumpets or triumph, but with sweat on brows and aching shoulders, the sun unrelenting as it hovered low and golden over the fields. In Groningham, every able body, from child to elder, had a task. Sickles sang quietly through the grain, bundles were stacked into stooks and carts creaked under their weight. It was the busiest season of the year, and yet it was one most looked forward to. Because harvest, even in its hardship, meant something essential, food for a while would not be guessed at. For Janet, it meant rising before the sun to gather grain husks fallen in the dirt. Gleaning, they called it, a task left for the poorest. Her fingers were scratched and her dress worn thin at the knees, but each handful of barley or rye was gathered with quiet care. At home, her mother laid them out to dry, then pounded them into meal. It would not make light bread, but it would thicken a stew, feed the family, and taste, at the very least, like effort. In the manor's fields, labourers toiled under watchful eyes. Their share of the harvest was modest, a portion of grain, sometimes a measure of beans or peas, and the rights to glean when the carts had gone. Berth, in the manor kitchens, was already preparing to receive sacks of fresh grain. The cook knew better than to waste time. She boiled lentils that night with the first barley from the field, adding parsley, celery root and a dollop of lard. To the servants, it was a feast. The barley was soft, the lentils sweet, the greens still green. She also set aside a pan of trencher bread, thick slabs of doughy rye, baked dense and round. These would not be eaten directly but used in place of plates. They would soak up gravies and sauces, then be given to the poor or the dogs. But they were food still, and few ever refused them. In the village, Mechtilde boiled the last of her stored peas and added fresh leeks. The colour of her pot changed from the dull brown of dried foods to the pale green of living ones. She seasoned it with vinegar and mustard seed. For once, it smelled sharp and bright. She dipped a piece of bread into it, chewing slowly as she watched the dusk settle through her crooked window. She had lived through too many seasons to waste this one on indulgence, but she allowed herself a second bowl. The blacksmith's wife, Rotye, tried her hand at turnip cakes, grated root mixed with ground oats and egg, then fried until crisp. The pan hissed and spat, sending up smoke and a smell that drew the children from the doorway. The cakes browned quick, soft inside, crunchy at the edges. She served them with a pinch of salt and a drizzle of strong ale. The family ate with their fingers, licking the grease with quiet delight. By the stream, Martin the fisherman worked with his son to salt their catch. The river had yielded more than usual, fat bream and tench writhing in the net. They slit and cleaned each fish with practised hands, rubbing salt into every crevice. Then the fish were layered in a barrel, weighed down with stones and set to rest in the smokehouse. This would be their food for weeks to come, the sharp tang of salt a constant companion. In the monastery, Brother Elric helped prepare the harvest bread, a tradition marked by the mixing of new flour, dried fruit and ale into a dense loaf. It was baked in silence, the smell a hymn in itself. The monks shared it in their refectory, breaking pieces with solemn hands, eating slowly and without conversation. It was not sweet, not by any modern sense, but the raisins gave it depth, and the ale a warmth that stayed on the tongue. He made a note in his ledger. Harvest bread, heavy, brown, filled with small joys. Even the tanner's apprentices received their share of the season. A neighbour had bartered a haunch of goat for a pair of repaired boots, and it was roasted over a low fire, seasoned with sage and onions. The meat, though tough, was rich with flavour, and the smell filled their workshop until even the scent of cured hides was forgotten. They ate seated on overturned tubs, drinking ale from cracked mugs, their mouths full and their chatter louder than usual. On the second day of harvest, Lady Isabel sent for a pudding, made from fresh milk, eggs and a little flour, steamed in a cloth bag until firm. Berth prepared it with diligence, adding a splash of rosewater and sprinkling crushed almond on top. When it was served, warm and pale, it melted on the tongue like custard. Lady Isabel smiled faintly, though she said nothing. The bowl was scraped clean. That same night, Janet and her mother ate oat cakes by candlelight. They were dry but hearty, eaten with onions sautéed in lard and a scoop of mashed beans. The candle sputtered, the meal quiet. Janet did not ask for more. She was learning, as all children in Groningham eventually did, that food was never to be taken for granted. Every bite was a chapter in a long story, one of labour, weather, mercy and time. The sky above was clear, stars scattered like grain across black velvet. In homes and huts, in cellars and kitchens, food was tucked away, preserved, planned. The harvest was not celebration, it was preparation, because everyone knew what came next. The air shifted subtly as September deepened, the warmth of summer retreating like a fading ember. The fields of Groningham, once rustling with grain and labour, now lay quiet, their golden sheen turned to brittle stubble. In the hedgerows, berries shrivelled and the first leaves began to curl and fall. The harvest had passed. What remained was the careful task of storage, the true work of survival. In the heart of the village, Janet's mother moved with steady purpose. She laid out herbs to dry on linen cloths, thyme, wormwood, sage and rue, each chosen for its strength, not its flavour. These would be used to ward off rot in meats, to flavour broths made from bones, and to mix into ale as tonic. The kitchen smelled sharp and clean, the scent of plants overpowering the lingering odours of lard and smoke. Their small cellar had been swept and made ready. Clay jars lined the walls, sealed with wax and cloth. There were beans, peas, onions braided and hung, a crock of pickled turnips, and a single pot of stewed apples, dark, dense, and preserved with honey. It was the only sweet thing they owned. Outside, in the courtyard near the bakehouse, Toon stacked bundles of dried wood for the coming months. The fire would need to be constant, not just for warmth, but for food. Cold killed, yes, but it was hunger that brought despair. Bread would need to be baked more carefully now, like with flour mixed from multiple sources, rye, oats, peas, sometimes even dried chestnuts ground finely. It was a balancing act, each loaf a product of invention as much as labour. Toon had begun to experiment with a new mixture, using bean flour to stretch the wheat. The result was heavier than expected, with a faint bitterness that clung to the mouth. But it kept longer, and that, in the weeks to come, would matter far more than taste. At the manor, Berthe turned her attention to slaughtering preparations. The pigs would soon be cold and every part would be used. Nothing was wasted. The blood would be caught and stirred into sausages with oats and onions. The intestines, cleaned thoroughly, would be used as casings. The fat rendered into tallow, the bones boiled for broth, the feet pickled in vinegar and herbs. She sharpened knives at dawn, her hands red and cracked. The meat was not yet on the table, but already its presence was felt. In a shaded corner of the monastery garden, Brother Elric noted the slow withering of the last lettuces and the browning tops of the leeks. He clipped what remained and stored the leaves in oiled cloth. Inside, in the stillness of the cloister, the brothers ground dried herbs and roots, angelica, fennel, lovage, all meant for teas and tisanes, some for flavour, more for healing. Meals had already begun to change. The lentils were drier, the greens fewer, the porridge thicker, more heavily salted. Elric found himself longing for the simple apple slices of summer, now vanished, or the tang of spring nettles. But he ate without complaint, spooning each mouthful slowly, grateful even for the blandness. It meant he could still chew, still swallow, still work. In Mechtild's cottage, a broth of bones simmered over a fire banked low. She had no meat, only the bones of a rabbit given to her by the carpenter, long after the flesh had been stripped. But bones were valuable. They gave body to water, transformed it. She added garlic, dried marjoram, and a crust of stale bread to thicken it. The smell filled the room, rich and smoky. She ate crouched near the hearth, dipping her spoon slowly, eyes closed. It was not hunger she feared now, but weakness. Winter made bones brittle and minds dim. She would need her strength. The tanner's apprentices had begun trading labour for food. A roof mended in exchange for a small wheel of cheese. A gate repaired for a measure of salted herring. It was understood barter was survival. Money meant little when bellies ached. One evening they received a gift, a jug of strong ale and a pie made from sheep's pluck, heart, liver and lungs, minced with barley and suet, baked into a thick crust. It smelled of iron and herbs. They tore it apart with their hands, chewing loudly, speaking little. It was the best thing they'd eaten in weeks. Rocha, the blacksmith's wife, preserved her onions in ash. She laid them carefully in layers, separated by fine grey powder. The old method passed from mother to daughter. The ash drew moisture, kept mould at bay. The onions would last through winter, or so she hoped. She also rendered the last of the season's butter. It would be kept in a small jar, salted and sealed, used only sparingly. Most of their fat now came from drippings or tallow, heavy and flavourless, but dependable. When it set, it turned pale and waxy, a quiet promise in a dark kitchen. At night, the village was still. The clamour of harvest had faded, replaced by the hushed routines of readiness. Fires flickered behind shuttered windows. The smell of fermentation, sour, yeasty, sharp, drifted between cottages. Somewhere, a child coughed. A dog stirred, then settled again. Janet lay beneath a heavy wool blanket, her belly warm with stew, her breath slow. She did not know how long the stores would last. But for tonight, she was fed. For tonight, the world was still turning gently in her favour. The days shortened swiftly now, as though the sun itself had grown weary of the sky. Frost came one morning without warning, whitening the thatched roofs of Groningham and stiffening the damp earth beneath wooden clogs. Smoke rose earlier and lingered longer, curling from chimney pots and settling low across the fields. The world had turned. Winter had begun its quiet siege. In the blacksmith's cottage, Rocha stirred a thick paste of mashed beans and stale bread, seasoned only with salt and a little animal fat she had scraped from a cooled broth the night before. The paste was spread thin on flat stones and set close to the hearth, where it dried into chewy cakes. These would be kept in a cloth bag, softened later in hot ale or broth, and eaten when food grew scarce. They had no name, just them or those little ones, as her children called them. The broth itself had been made from pig's feet, slow-boiled for hours until the skin gave way and the gelatin turned the liquid rich and sticky. Rocha had added vinegar and dried thyme to temper the fattiness, and though the flavour was bold and unfamiliar to the children, it was warm, filling and welcome. In the monastery, the meals had grown more austere. The garden was bare now, its soil covered in rime, the beds dormant. The brothers subsisted on dried lentils, old onions and oat porridge cooked over slow fires. Each meal was taken in silence, broken only by the soft clatter of spoons on wooden bowls and the occasional whispered prayer. Brother Elric, ever diligent, copied a passage about preserving turnips in sand, noting it carefully in the margins of an old ledger. He also recorded a recipe he had gleaned from an elderly lay brother. A vinegar soup made from pickled cabbage brine, hot water and a spoonful of ground mustard. Sour but stimulating, the brother had said, and Elric had found it oddly pleasant, though it stung the tongue and lingered in the chest. In her small cottage near the woods, Mechtild lived largely on what she had hidden away. Her jars of beans, dried greens and foraged mushrooms were lined up like soldiers, each one precious. She had even managed to trap a squirrel the week prior, its small body now stewing gently with barley and wild garlic. The meat was dark, stringy and faintly sweet, reminding her of autumn chestnuts and smoke. She ate slowly, drawing warmth from the bowl into her hands. The spoon, carved long ago by her late husband, was worn smooth by years of use. She had little, but she had enough, and in winter that was more than most could hope for. Toon the baker now worked by lamplight, his hands pale with flour, his cheeks raw from the cold that crept even into the bakehouse. The dough rose slowly in the chill air, and he had to knead it longer, coaxing warmth into it with the heat of his own skin. The loaves were smaller now, made with less wheat and more filler, beans, chestnuts, bran, even ground acorns when they could be foraged and leached of bitterness. The bread turned out darker, heavier and more sour than ever, but it lasted. And when warmed near the fire and eaten with a bit of salted cheese or stew, it gave the illusion of nourishment enough to sustain hope. Down by the stream, Martin had long since pulled his nets for the year. The water ran slow and glassy, rimmed with ice each morning. He lived now on what he had dried and salted. The fish, curled and blackened with smoke, were tough and briny, requiring long boiling to make them tender. He shared a piece with a passing neighbour one afternoon, the carpenter, who brought him a small jug of mead in return. The exchange was quiet, practical, and appreciated on both sides. In the manor, birth had turned the kitchens into a place of preservation. The meat salted earlier in the season was now brought out in measured portions. Pork belly, smoked goose, dried sausage hung in the rafters. The cellar was a treasure of salted turnips, pickled onions, and dense cheese wheels coated in beeswax. Yet even here, where food was more plentiful, there was no feasting now. That time had passed. Lady Isabel rarely descended for meals, taking instead her portions in her private chambers, usually a bit of soft cheese with spiced wine or a bowl of boiled apples with cinnamon. Her appetite waned in winter, as it always had. Cold, she said, dulled her senses. Birth knew better. Cold dulled the soul, not just the palate. The tanner's apprentices ate by firelight, crouched around a pot of thick gruel made from millet, turnip, and the last of the blood sausage. The gruel clung to their spoons, congealing as it cooled. They slurped quickly, knowing better than to speak between bites. Hunger had made them lean but strong. It had also made them quiet. And in Janet's home, the fire burned low but steady. Her mother had made a stew of split peas, laced with dried mint and thickened with the heel of a loaf saved from the week before. She dropped in a bone, one used many times, polished smooth by broth. It gave off a faint flavour still, and that was enough. Janet cradled her bowl, steam rising in lazy ribbons. The taste was familiar, earthy, simple, enduring. She could not remember the last time she had tasted sweetness or crunch or cream. But this was warm, and she had a blanket, and the night was quiet. Outside, the village lay still beneath a thin crust of frost. Stars blinked between bare tree limbs. The world had hardened but not yet closed. Beneath the cold soil, roots still lived, and inside every home a pot still simmered. The heart of winter settled over Groningham like a woolen shroud, soft, heavy and absolute. Snow came in quiet layers, first as dust, then as drifts, muffling the sounds of the village until even the crows seemed to caw more softly. Footsteps vanished behind those who made them. Doors opened and shut quickly. Firewood, once neatly stacked, now dwindled with each passing night. Meals were no longer measured in variety or taste, but in warmth. A bowl of hot food was not just sustenance. It was comfort, defence, something to gather around when the wind howled like wolves at the eaves. In the dark hours before dawn, Rokje prepared breakfast with fingers numb from splitting kindling. She boiled oats with water and salt, then added grated parsnip and a spoonful of leftover drippings saved in a pottery jar. The result was thick, pale and greasy, enough to coat the stomach against the day's cold. Her children, still wrapped in blankets near the hearth, sat cross-legged to eat, steam curling from their bowls into the sharp morning air. She handed her husband a piece of toasted rye bread, hardened, then warmed on the hearthstone until it could be chewed. He ate without speaking, wiping his hands on a cloth and tying his apron. The forge would be cold, the bellows stiff, but work did not wait for spring. In Mechtild's cottage, a single candle burned as she prepared her midday meal. The snow on her roof was thick, insulating but weighty, and she worried it might collapse. Her stew, made the night before, was reheated with care. Potatoes, onion skins and the fat rind of cheese too tough to chew, but full of flavour when boiled. She let it simmer slowly, allowing the broth to deepen and darken. She whispered to it sometimes, as though encouraging it to stay strong, to stretch further than it should. A meal was a conversation in winter, a plea, a pact, a shared burden. And the pot, faithful and cracked at the handle, always replied with steam and scent. Down in the village, Janet and her mother were making a kind of pottage cake, a thick fried patty made from leftover stew and barley flour, shaped into rounds and browned in lard. The outside crisped, the inside steamed. It was the most texture they'd had in weeks. Janet liked the crust best, dark and chewy, tasting faintly of onions and smoke. Her mother gave her the first one without speaking, then turned back to the pan. They would make 6, no more. Enough for the day. The next meal would have to be thought of again from the bottom up. The baker, Toon, had taken to baking twice a week instead of daily. The loaves were heavier now and longer lasting. He used a mixture of old flour and new, coarsely ground oats and fava bean meal, mixed with his ever-sour balm. The bread was so dense it had to be sliced thin and toasted before it was edible, but it filled the belly and bore well under freezing temperatures. Sometimes he added crushed juniper berries, which gave the loaves a sharp, almost resinous tang. He liked the way they cleared his nose and reminded him of the green months. Not everyone appreciated it, but no one refused the bread. The tanner's apprentices shared a supper of blood pudding, slices cut thick from a sausage boiled 2 days before. It was fried in tallow until the edges curled and crisped, then served on oatcakes with boiled carrot mash. The smell was strong and rich, clinging to their skin and clothes. They ate by lantern light, surrounded by tools and hides, talking softly about the cold and how it worked its way into bone. In the manor, the mood was subdued. The feasting of Christmas had passed, and with it the more generous meals. Now, Berth oversaw plain fare, soups of turnip and barley, pies filled with preserved meats, and boiled puddings made from dried fruits and suet. Lady Isabel complained of the heaviness, preferring her rosewater tarts and candied quince, now long gone. Still, a new delivery of wine from the south had arrived, dark, thick and spiced with cloves. Berth used some to make mulled wine for the staff, mixing it with honey and a shaving of nutmeg. It was a rare treat, warming and almost sweet. The smell drifted down the servants' hall and lingered like a memory. At the monastery, the brothers huddled in the scriptorium beneath thick robes. Meals were fewer now, simple bowls of boiled wheat with dried onion or small wedges of rye bread served with fermented cheese. Elric, his hands stiff from cold ink and colder pages, took comfort in a small jar of salted pears he had hidden away. He ate one by candlelight, the fruit leathery and tart. It tasted of summer, of sun and sweat and bees. He made a note in his ledger: pears, salted, astringent but steadying, a fruit with memory. Outside, the snow fell lightly, gently, without wind. The sound it made, soft against the thatch, the trees, the stone, was like breathing. Groningham exhaled with it, each house a chest rising and falling slowly in the hush. There were no feasts, no songs, no bells, only the low murmur of meals being made, shared, remembered. Food in winter was not for joy, it was for holding on, and hold on, they did. The snow did not melt, not yet. It settled deeper into the seams of Groningham, blanketing the crooked fences and roof lines, softening the world into a muted, unchanging hush. Days began with frost on eyelashes and ended with frozen water buckets. Food became something drawn from memory as much as from pantry. What was eaten now had been gathered, dried, salted or prepared long ago. And still, it had to stretch further. In her low-beamed cottage, Mechtild broke apart the last of her dried mushrooms. She had stored them in linen pouches, tied with twine and hung from the rafters, where they swayed gently with each passing draught. The mushrooms were brittle, almost weightless, but when dropped into hot water, they softened slowly, darkening the broth and releasing a scent of forest soil. She added a few grains of barley, a pinch of salt and a sliver of garlic. The result was thin, but warm. She poured the stew into her old wooden bowl, the one with the hairline crack near the rim. As she sipped, she closed her eyes and remembered the shade of trees, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. The bowl steamed quietly in her hands, and she was, for a time, full. In the blacksmith's house, Roche prepared one of the last jars of preserved cabbage. The pickled leaves, packed in brine with mustard seeds and dill, had turned translucent. She unwrapped the wax-sealed lid, the vinegar smell rising sharply into the cold air. The cabbage was chopped and added to a pot of potato and leeks, forming a stew that was sour, salty, and deeply satisfying in its warmth. She fried scraps of cured pork in a pan, letting the fat melt and crackle before pouring it into the pot. The smell filled the cottage like a promise. Her husband, hunched near the hearth with stiff fingers, turned his head and breathed deeply. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. At the bakehouse, Toon was burning the last of the alder wood. Less smoke, less scent, but it burned clean and hot. He baked small rolls this time, using a mixture of pea flour and barley, with a touch of ground fennel from a forgotten jar. The dough was stiff, the crust hard, but when eaten warm with a smear of cheese or a spoonful of lard, it was enough to dull the hunger. He gave 3 rolls to a passing widow who traded him a skein of wool. No coins changed hands, just gestures, the unspoken economy of survival. In the monastery, Brother Elric visited the infirmary. Ailing brothers were given warm milk with honey when it could be spared, or thin gruel infused with sage and wild thyme. He watched as a novice spooned broth into the mouth of an old monk, too frail to hold the bowl. The room smelled of wax, herbs, and faintly sour breath. Elric returned to the kitchen and prepared a simple drink from warmed ale, beaten eggs, and a spoonful of stale honey, a posset. It was thickened over low flame and poured into small wooden cups. He sipped one quietly, seated by a slit window, watching the slow dance of snow beyond the glass. The richness sat in his stomach like a stone, comforting and slow to fade. In the manor, Berth prepared a special dish for Candlemas, a pie filled with onions, prunes and chopped veal, heavily spiced with pepper and cloves. The crust was tough but golden, and the pie was served hot to the lord and his lady with a goblet of warmed wine. Lady Isabel wrinkled her nose at the sweetness but said nothing. She ate half, passed the rest to her steward. The kitchen staff, meanwhile, feasted on the trimmed edges, bites of veal, soaked prunes, thick gravy. The flavour was rich, heavy with spice and vinegar. It lingered on the tongue, a rare indulgence. Berth made sure the scullery boys received their share. Winter did not care for rank. By the stream, now frozen and silent, Martin split open a jar of pickled eels. They had been layered in vinegar with horseradish and juniper, their flesh dense and oily. He boiled them with turnips and served them with oat mash. The meal was unpleasant to the nose, but deeply nourishing. He chewed slowly, bones and all, and wiped his mouth with a ragged sleeve. Janet, too, ate eel that night, just a sliver given by a neighbour in trade for a small bundle of firewood. Her mother had sliced it thin and mixed it with peas and bread soaked in ale. It was a strange dish, tangy and chewy but warm. Janet pressed her fingers around the wooden bowl, savouring the warmth more than the flavour. Her mother hummed quietly as she cleaned the spoon, dipping it into boiling water with care. Every dish now was precious, every meal measured in both calories and gratitude. They had made it through another day, was all anyone asked. Outside, the night was thick and silent. The snow had stopped. The sky was dark and low, the moon hidden. From one end of Groningham to the other, the world was asleep or trying to be. Beneath the stillness, pots cooled, bellies rested, and hopes, small and stubborn, kept watch like coals under ash. The deep chill began to loosen its grip, ever so slightly. In the first week of February, a shift in the wind hinted at something just beyond winter's veil. The air no longer bit the skin as fiercely, and the snow took longer to fall, shorter to melt. But the people of Groningham knew better than to trust such signs. The harshest storms often came when spring seemed only a breath away. In the cramped warmth of the blacksmith's house, Rutger prepared a broth from dried carrots, old celery roots, and bits of smoked sausage scraped from the bone. She let it simmer low, adding a bay leaf and a spoon of flour to thicken it. The result was more nourishing than flavourful, but it filled the room with a scent that felt, strangely, like reassurance. Her husband, fingers blistered from forging nails with frozen iron, leaned over his bowl and ate with quiet appreciation. The children, noses red and shoulders hunched in oversized cloaks, took turns dipping crusts of stale bread into the broth until their cheeks turned pink from the steam. In her lonely cottage near the woodline, Mechtild cooked her last handful of dried chestnuts. She ground them with a stone into a coarse flour, then boiled it with water and a pinch of salt. The chestnut mash thickened like porridge, its colour soft and brown, its scent nutty and earthy. She poured it into a shallow bowl, added a spoon of sour milk, and sat near the fire to eat. The taste was plain, almost bland, but familiar. Chestnuts had once been food for pigs and paupers alike, but in winters such as these they became something to be grateful for. She ate slowly, with small wooden spoonfuls, and let the warmth settle into her bones. At the monastery, the brothers prepared for Lent. The usual meals, already simple, grew simpler still. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. Bread and ale, broth made from onions and herbs, and on feast days a few dried peas. Brother Elric spent his evenings by candlelight, copying recipes from an old Roman text, wondering how people before had seasoned without salt or fed themselves on lentils for weeks. In a margin he wrote, "For each grain of spice, 100 days of toil. For each crumb of cheese, a prayer answered." One of the older brothers, too weak to rise from his cot, was brought a bowl of hot water steeped with wild thyme and a slice of bread soaked in it. He whispered thanks, eyes closed, hands trembling around the bowl. Elric watched him sip and saw in that moment the sacrament in something so small. Down by the frozen stream, Martin the fisherman was repairing nets by lamplight. No fish now, but soon, he told himself. The river would thaw, the fish would return. For now, he ate oatcakes and pickled onions, each bite sharp enough to sting the eyes. He drank weak ale from a wooden mug and wiped his fingers on a strip of linen. It was not joy, but it was enough. In the manor kitchens, Berth boiled parsnips and leeks with stale bread and sheep's marrow, creating a dish soft enough for Lady Isabel's weakening appetite. The marrow melted into the broth, giving it a silken texture. A sprinkle of nutmeg masked its heaviness, and the lady, pale and draped in layers, sipped it slowly from a porcelain bowl. Berth also prepared a thick gruel for the staff. Barley, cabbage, and bits of salted mutton too stringy for the Lord's table. It was ladled out in generous portions, and the kitchen workers sat shoulder to shoulder, bowls in their laps, murmuring their thanks with spoons already raised. Janet and her mother, like many others, had entered the final stretch of their winter stores. The dried peas were nearly gone, the pickled vegetables dwindling. That night, they boiled cracked rye with vinegar and a few slices of old apple, shriveled but sweetened by the fire. The porridge was sour-sweet, strange on the tongue, but oddly comforting. Janet's mother lit a candle stub, one of the last, and placed it on the table. The flame flickered in the draught from the shutters, casting long shadows. They ate slowly, speaking little, wrapped in cloaks and wool. When the porridge was finished, Janet licked the bowl clean. The days ahead would not be easy. They never were this time of year. But there was a rhythm to the struggle now, a kind of hard-earned grace. The people of Groningham knew their food might not delight, but it would endure. And through it, they endured. Outside, the frost was thin on the thatch. Somewhere in the dark hollows of the earth, roots stirred. The snow still came, but more softly now. A change was coming, not yet visible, not yet tasted. But close enough to wait for. The final frost came in the 3rd week of March, quiet and pale, clinging to the thatched roofs like breath on glass. By mid-morning, it melted into rivulets that ran along the edges of roads and soaked the tired soil beneath. Groningham stirred with the kind of energy that comes not from fullness, but from the scent of change. Inside Janet's cottage, the last of the turnip pickles were lifted from their jar, pale and softened by the brine, almost translucent. Her mother chopped them finely and added them to a barley mash, along with a spoonful of dried mustard greens, crushed with a pestle until they turned to powder. The dish was pungent and sharp, but it brought a new kind of heat, one that clung to the tongue and nose rather than the belly. Outside, the earth had begun to break open. Thin shoots of sorrel and dandelion pushed through the thawed edges of the paths, timid but determined. The village children, led by older siblings, were sent out with knives and baskets to gather what they could. Wild greens were among the first gifts of spring, bitter, fibrous, and full of life. Mechtild crouched near her fence line, snipping tender chickweed from between the stones. She worked slowly, her knees creaking, her shawl pulled tight. In a pouch at her hip, she carried dried apple peel and a few walnut shells. The greens she gathered would be boiled into a thin broth. The peel added for sourness, the shells cracked for any last sliver of nut inside. That evening, she simmered it all together over a weak flame. The result was little more than green water, dotted with flecks of brown and yellow. But when she lifted the spoon, it smelled of earth, of cold wind turned soft, of things returning. At the bakehouse, Toon baked with the last of the autumn flour, mixing it with dried mashed beans to stretch it further. The dough was slack, the rise uneven, but he shaped the loaves with care. They were darker than usual, their crusts nearly black, but they held together. People lined up before sunrise, hunched and silent, each with a coin or something to trade, a spool of thread, a strip of dried meat, a flask of vinegar. He gave away what he could, knowing that soon, with spring grain sown and summer not far behind, the rhythm would shift again. But for now, he pressed his palms into the dough and folded it with quiet hope. In the monastery, Brother Elric stood beneath the cloisters, his breath forming soft clouds in the morning air. The herb garden was still asleep, but he saw green tips rising between the frost-bitten stalks. He bent low and touched the soil. It was no longer hard. He smiled faintly and went to the kitchens to share the news. That day, the monks dined on lentils and barley with vinegar, the same as they had for weeks. But now there was crushed dried mint added to the pot, a hint of something new, something from the world that waited beyond the walls. Down by the stream, Martin had returned to the water. The ice had retreated from the banks, and he cast his net carefully, slowly, more as ritual than expectation. After hours of patience, he pulled in 2 small fish, dull silver, thin but alive. He carried them home like treasure. That night, he boiled them whole with onions and added slices of stale rye to the broth. The fish were not filleted, only gutted and split, their bones picked out with fingers and patience. He ate alone, as he always did, and washed the bowl with melted snow. At the manor, Berth prepared her first spring meal, a dish of poached eggs with herbs, parsley, chervil and chives, from the sheltered side of the stone wall. The eggs had come from hens newly laying, pale-shelled and precious. She simmered them gently in vinegar, then laid them over toasted trencher bread with a drizzle of thick ale and crushed pepper. Lady Isabel ate with visible pleasure for the first time in weeks. She asked for a second egg. Berth, hiding a smile, complied. The staff shared their own meal afterward, bean mash with onions and the same herbs, the pot scraped clean to the bottom. It was sharp, fresh and green, a flavour that felt almost forgotten. Rotgi prepared her own supper with care that evening. She had found early nettles in the corner of the yard, near the stone where the sun struck longest. She wore gloves to gather them, then boiled them until soft, pressing them into oatcakes and frying them in goose fat saved from Candlemas. The cakes hissed on the pan, releasing a smell like burnt hay and pepper. Her family ate with curiosity, then hunger, then a kind of quiet awe. They had not eaten anything green in weeks. It tasted like the season turning. In the dark, Janet lay curled beneath the wool blanket, her belly warm from a soup of wild greens, turnip mash and onion. She watched the last flicker of candlelight fade and listened to the quiet creak of the house around her. Outside, snow melted into the roots of new things. Under frost, flavour stirred. And somewhere between sleep and hunger, the people of Groningham dreamed not of feasts or luxuries, but of meals no longer made of necessity, but choice. Not yet, but soon. The thaw came in earnest, not with a dramatic rush, but with a slow and steady unravelling. One morning, the village awoke to find the snow had vanished from the rooftops. Mud replaced frost, and birds, silent for so long, began to chirp softly at the edge of the woods. Water pooled in low places, and the air carried a dampness that clung to wool and skin alike. Spring had arrived, not with celebration, but with a quiet sigh. In the gardens behind the cottages, spades were drawn from hooks, and earth was turned with cautious hands. The soil was dark and rich, though heavy from the melt. Janet's mother knelt in the wet loam, planting onions, mustard greens and beans. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, her knees sunk into the mud. This was not the work of pleasure, but of assurance. Seeds were not promises, they were gambles. That evening they ate nettle soup again, this time with the addition of wild chervil and a splash of vinegar. The flavour had deepened, less bitter now, more rounded. Janet was beginning to recognise the changing of the seasons by the taste in her bowl rather than the light in the sky. Mechtild, too, had ventured into her small garden patch. Her steps were slow, her fingers stiff, but she managed to prune the elder tree and gather the first tender shoots of good King Henry. These she washed and boiled gently, then mashed with breadcrumbs and a bit of whey skimmed from sour milk. The mixture was thick and soft, eaten with a spoon and a slice of bread baked last week and hardened since. She sat on her stool, watching the light shift across her floorboards, chewing slowly. The food was mild, but there was life in it. It did not speak of preservation or waiting, it spoke of beginnings. At the monastery, Brother Elric kept a new tally in his ledger, one not of meals, but of sprouted herbs. Mint, 6 shoots. Fennel, not yet, 2 small leaves. He began to steep nettle tips in hot water for tea, adding dried apple for sweetness. The brothers drank it gratefully, hands wrapped around their mugs, murmuring prayers of thanks for every swallow. On Sundays, their bread was now mixed with fresh leaven, no longer dried or strained. It rose better, smelled brighter. They ate it with onion broth and stewed dried cherries, a rare holdover from the autumn stores. The cherries had darkened with time, their flavour sharper, less sweet. But still they were fruit, and the monks said nothing but their blessings as they chewed. Toon, the baker, resumed baking smaller loaves more often. He experimented with crushed wild garlic leaves, kneading them into the dough with a touch of lard. The result was uneven in rise, but the scent, sharp, pungent, alive, filled the bakehouse like a kind of hymn. He handed a loaf to a tired cooper passing by, who bit into it as if tasting something sacred. By the manor, Berth had begun boiling eggs in vinegar, herbs and wine. These she would store in clay pots, the eggs pickling slowly into something rich and sour. It was not an old custom, but one learned from a visiting merchant years before. Lady Isabel, seated at her window with shawls across her knees, ate 2 with black bread and a dish of mustard greens in oil. She nodded to Berth in passing and said only, "They remind me of my father's kitchens." In the servants' hall, the same greens were mixed with barley and garlic and served as a thick stew. A boy new to the staff wrinkled his nose but ate every spoonful. The others did not tease him. They had once reacted the same. Every bitter bite would sweeten with time. Rokia was boiling barley and wild sorrel when the first bees were seen in the yard. She leaned out the cottage door, wooden spoon still in hand, and watched them float and drift over the mud and old hay. Her children followed them with their eyes. No one spoke. That evening, she stirred some of her barley with dried prunes and sage and served it warm, letting the fruit rehydrate into soft bursts of sweetness. Down by the stream, Martin brought in his first real catch since the freeze. Small perch, not many, but enough. He fried them over a low fire, dusted with flour and pepper, and served them on stale bread soaked in their own fat. The fish were bony and strong tasting, but fresh, undeniably fresh. It was the taste of the season turning. Janet helped her mother prepare wild garlic for drying the next morning, laying the leaves flat on the tablecloth near the window. The sun struck the edge of the cloth, and she could smell the sharpness in the air. Her mother gave her a piece of oatcake with goose fat and crushed garlic spread over it. She bit into it and felt her tongue prickle. It was strange, intense, alive. That night, she dreamt not of full tables or roasted meats, but of green fields, of walking barefoot on soft earth, of the smell of herbs rising from a pot not out of need, but because they were there, because they could be. Spring had not yet fully arrived, but it had been tasted, and in Groningham that was enough to begin again. With the lengthening of days came a softness to the world that Groningham had not felt in many months. The wind no longer bit. The ground, though still streaked with mud, bore footprints instead of ice. Children returned to the fields to dig and play, their laughter echoing faintly between the low stone walls. In kitchens and cellars, the rhythm of meals shifted once again, from preservation to emergence. Janet's mother was kneeling in the garden, coaxing shoots of cabbage and broad beans from the loam with careful fingers. The sun, weak but present, warmed her back as she planted. A small pot of milk sat nearby, curdling slowly into soft cheese wrapped in cloth and weighted with a stone. It was the first fresh milk of the season, a portion shared from the neighbour's cow, and it was being transformed into something rare and indulgent, food that was both fresh and familiar. That evening, the cheese was unwrapped, soft and damp, speckled with chives pulled from the garden edge. It was spread onto flatbread baked over coals, served warm beside a soup of lentils and dandelion leaves. Janet's eyes widened with the first bite. The cheese was tangy, alive, and unlike anything she remembered tasting in the long months of cold. Mechtild Tild, too, was returning to her foraging ways. With a basket and a walking stick, she wandered slowly along the old monastery path, her eyes sharp despite her age. She found early violets, chickweed and bittercress, which she bundled into her cloak. When she returned, she boiled water and added the greens with vinegar and a small wedge of dried apple. The resulting broth was thin and bright, almost floral, and she drank it slowly by the hearth, her toes tucked beneath a shawl. She thought of her mother, who had taught her which greens could be eaten and which would bring sleep forever. She thought of the first spring she could remember, when snow still clung to fence posts and yet her bowl had tasted of green. In the monastery kitchen, Brother Elric was writing more than usual. He had begun compiling a full season's record of food, the Annals of the Hearth, he called it quietly, though no one had asked for such a book. It included notes on stews and breads, on infusions and curings, but also on hunger, on hope, and on the strange human ability to transform scarcity into ritual. He also noted that the monks had started receiving donations again. A local widow had brought eggs wrapped in straw. Another villager cured meat. It was not almsgiving, not entirely. It was habit, woven into the structure of their world. The monks in return offered prayers and sometimes small tinctures or herbal salves. The exchange had begun anew, like everything else. Down by the stream, Martin caught a trout, larger than usual, its scales glinting in the morning sun. He cleaned it carefully, then wrapped it in dock leaves and clay before placing it in the coals. This ancient method, learned from his grandfather, allowed the fish to steam within its casing. When the clay was cracked open, the skin came with it, leaving the tender meat inside, moist and fragrant. He brought a piece to the tanner's apprentice in trade for a mended net. The boy took it home and shared it with his family, who ate it with boiled potatoes and mustard greens. The flavours mingled, smoky fish, sharp greens, the faint sweetness of spring. It was humble, but it was special. Toon, now baking with more freedom, had begun incorporating fresh herbs into his loaves. One afternoon, he crafted a rye bread with wild garlic and dried pear slices. one of the few combinations that allowed sweetness to shine through the density. He left a small piece on the chapel steps, as was custom, and the rest disappeared within hours. In the manor kitchen, Berth boiled new carrots with wine and rosemary, serving them with a stew of mutton and barley. The dish was earthy, rich, and aromatic. Lady Isabel, her hands warmer now and her appetite restored, declared it fitting for the season. What she meant, Berth knew, was that it tasted of change, not of indulgence, but of things waking up. The staff ate a simpler version, barley with chopped greens and bits of fatback saved from the Easter feast. It was salty, soft and comforting. No one asked for more than what was served. Roach's household had begun making onion cakes again, fried in a thin layer of goose fat. They crackled on the pan and were eaten by hand, dipped into vinegar and sprinkled with salt. One child spilled his and wept until another tore theirs in half to share. It was the kind of meal that taught both hunger and kindness. That night, as Groningham settled beneath a sky clear and violet with stars, the scents that drifted from its cottages were subtly different, brighter, greener, touched with herbs and steam instead of smoke. No feast had come, but the leanest days had passed. Janet looked out from the doorway, the last spoonful of soup cooling in her bowl. A breeze carried the smell of damp soil, distant blossoms, and something more elusive. Possibility. She finished her meal and closed the door gently. Spring was not something one celebrated in Groningham. It was something one tasted, one stirred, one chewed slowly until it sank deep into the bones. And at last, it had arrived. The month of April arrived with soft rains and gentle winds, teasing colour from the once faded fields. In Groningham, the meadows that had worn a cloak of grey for so long began to don green once more. Young grass sprouting along footpaths, buds unfurling on hedges, and the first trembling petals of wildflowers dotting the landscape like scattered embroidery. The world, after long months of quiet, was speaking again, and the kitchens listened. At dawn, Rutger rose to grind the first of the season's rye. It had not yet been harvested anew, but what little remained from the previous year had grown softer with moisture in the air, easier to work with. She mixed it with dried thyme and water, left it to rise near the hearth, and shaped it into small rolls. These were baked over coals on flat stones, turning dark and crusty. She sliced them open and filled each with chopped boiled eggs and sour greens, mixed together with a little lard and salt. Her children chewed with furrowed brows. The flavour was sharp, the greens still bitter, but they ate every crumb. In her quiet home beyond the village, Mechtilde soaked dried beans overnight and cooked them with the last of her foraged dandelion roots. She stirred in vinegar and the rind of an aged cheese, cracked and hardened but still rich. The resulting dish was heavy and sour, with the root lending a roasted sweetness that lingered on the tongue. As she ate, she ran her fingers over her lap where a folded bundle of new linen rested. It was for wrapping herbs, she told herself, once they were ready to be cut and dried again. But something in her touch suggested she knew it might also be for binding bones if the season proved cruel. In Groningham, even the freshness of spring carried its shadows. Down in the village square, the first wild market had appeared. It was not an organised affair, just neighbours laying cloths across barrels and benches, exchanging what they had, bundles of nettles, small pots of early honey, eggs laid just that morning, a pouch of dried pears. A girl swapped a string of dried mushrooms for a small bottle of elderflower cordial, thick and golden. The cordial had been made in a distant cottage and traded its way across 4 households before landing in her hands. Janet walked through the square with her mother, watching quietly. They purchased nothing, but received 3 duck eggs in exchange for a bundle of early chives and a sprig of rue. That night, the eggs were boiled gently, the whites firm and the yolks deep yellow, nearly orange. They were sliced and placed atop a barley mash, drizzled with warm ale and black pepper. Janet stared at the plate in disbelief. It was beautiful, if such a word could be used for food. Simple, yes, but beautiful in its balance, its promise, its taste. At the monastery, Brother Elric tended the garden with renewed purpose. His hands sank into the cool earth as he planted rows of leeks and sorrel. In the cloister kitchen, he boiled lentils with wine and rosemary, then stirred in chopped turnip greens. It was served with hard cheese and dark rye bread, the crusts softened in broth. In the margins of his book he wrote, Spring, first full dish, bitter and soft. Memory of ash, promise of bloom. Toyne baked honey cakes for the feast of St. George. They were not as sweet as those made in finer towns, but he mixed honey with dried currants, crushed walnuts and ground oat flour, forming heavy golden discs. Each was wrapped in cloth and tied with string. He gave one to a neighbour whose wife had just given birth, another to the elderly couple near the chapel, and kept 2 for himself. He ate his that night with tea brewed from elderflowers and fennel. The cake was sticky, fragrant, and unlike anything he'd tasted since autumn. It reminded him of laughter, of warmth, not from flame but from closeness. Near the stream, Martin smoked trout over alder wood, using a technique passed down from his grandfather. The fish, gutted and hung, absorbed the smoke over hours until their silver skins darkened and their flesh tightened. When finished, they were wrapped in cloth and stored in a small crate filled with straw. One he ate with garlic broth and wild onions, the other he would trade when the time was right. Berth, ever resourceful, served a spring stew at the manor, a medley of young carrots, peas and mutton scraps, slow-cooked with vinegar and a touch of honey. Lady Isabel, her senses revived by the season, requested it be served with a side of fresh cheese and herb butter, spread on toasted trencher bread. The staff shared a pot of the same stew, minus the honey, with barley added to stretch it. The taste was full and round, and though no one said so, many licked their bowls clean. In every corner of Groningham, spring unfolded not in sudden colour, but in flavour. Tart greens, sweetened broth, warm bread, sharper herbs, and the slow return of texture. Food no longer clung to memory alone. It arrived in the hands, on the tongue, in the steam that rose from shared pots. And at twilight, as smoke drifted lazily into the pink-tinged sky and shutters closed with less urgency than in winter, there was a hum beneath it all, a low, steady hum, not of hunger or hardship, but of continuation, of life returning in small, edible ways. By early May, Groningham had transformed. The landscape, once a tapestry of browns and greys, now rippled in hues of green and gold. Meadows swelled with clover and buttercups, the hedgerows heavy with blossom. The air was sweet and damp, filled with the sounds of birds nesting and bees returning to their quiet labour. The village breathed differently now, not in sighs of endurance, but in slow, steady inhales of hope. And in every home, food began to change its tone. At the edge of the village, Rotke was rinsing young radishes in a basin of cool well water. The roots were small, pale, with rosy skins and long green tops. She sliced them thin and mixed them with boiled barley and wild mint, serving them cold with a splash of vinegar and a pinch of salt. It was sharp and cooling, the kind of meal best eaten at midday when the sun pressed down gently and the fire could remain unlit. She paired it with new bread, lighter now, made from fresher flour and water leavened not with old balm, but with fresh yeast from ale brewing. The crust cracked gently beneath the knife, the crumbs soft and springy. Her children blinked at it, uncertain. It had been months since bread was anything but dense and sour. Rotke smiled faintly as they chewed and looked up with cautious delight. In Mechtild's cottage, the midday meal was a thick soup of peas and lettuce, gently boiled in broth made from smoked bones. She stirred in a spoon of old mustard and a few leaves of ground ivy for aroma. The soup was served with hard cheese and a slab of oatcake. Mechtild ate slowly, alone but content, her window open to let the warm air in. She had planted her first rows of beets that morning, and her back ached from the bending. But the ache was familiar, and it brought with it the comfort of purpose. Janet and her mother, meanwhile, had begun drying wild herbs once again. Bundles of thyme, sage, and woodruff hung from their rafters, filling the house with a perfume that mingled with the smell of boiling greens and sourdough starter. Their midday dish was a soft mash of young turnips and parsnips, seasoned with garlic and stirred with goat's milk. The milk, fresh from the neighbour's flock, had a musky sweetness to it, odd at first, but growing more agreeable with each spoonful. They ate outside for the first time in months, seated on a bench near the cottage wall, warmed by the sun. The air buzzed faintly with insects. Janet closed her eyes between bites. At the monastery, Brother Elric led the novices in harvesting wild sorrel and good King Henry from the edges of the garden. These were added to a midday stew along with barley and crushed eggs. The eggs had been hard-boiled earlier and chopped coarsely, added not for their taste, but for the richness they lent the broth. Elric wrote later in his ledger, "Barley, eggs, and wild green stew. Thick, slightly bitter, echoes of milk and rain." He also noted how the brothers ate more slowly now, not from fatigue, but from the sudden novelty of variety. Each bowl was a little different. Each spoonful carried something new. Toon the baker had begun making flatbreads in the early morning, small rounds of dough flattened with his palms and cooked over hot stones. These he topped with curds and herbs or onions and pickled beetroot. A travelling peddler stopped to taste one and left with 6, promising to return in a fortnight with dried figs. It was the first time in over a year that figs had been mentioned aloud in Groningham. At the manor, Berth was preparing a feast for Ascension Day. There would be roast hen with garlic and rosemary, new carrots glazed with honey, and a pudding of eggs, cream, and ground almonds. The kitchen smelled of poultry and yeast, of wine and spiced fruit. Outside, on the far end of the gardens, servants were gathering young leeks and bundles of cress to serve with vinegar and oil. The Lord's table would gleam with silver and song. But in the kitchen, too, there was celebration. The cook's helpers dipped bread in fat drippings, shared sweetmeats made from dates and wine, and licked honey from their fingers when no one was looking. And across the village, meals reflected the same quiet festivity. Martin, the fisherman, fried perch in butter with wild herbs, then laid them atop mashed peas and served them with rye bread toasted over flame. He ate beneath a tree near the stream, listening to the water run freely once more. The tanner's apprentices had made a stew with early beans and smoked pork, thickened with crushed grains and served with raw sorrel on top. They ate shirtless in the sun, passing a jug of ale between them, mouths stained with grease and laughter. Everywhere! Food was returning, not in grandeur but in freshness. It carried the memory of winter, yes, but now it bore forward something brighter. Variety, flavour, even colour. Janet licked her fingers clean after finishing a tart made from curds and wild strawberries, her first taste of sweetness in months. Her mother had used a bit of flour, egg and milk to make the crust, and had crushed the berries with honey into a bright red paste. It stained their mouths and fingers. It tasted like sunlight. The past had not disappeared. The hunger still echoed, a reminder written into the rhythm of every meal. But now the food of Groningham no longer whispered only of survival. It began once again to speak of living. June arrived with a gentleness that made the hardships of winter feel briefly like a distant tale. The light stayed long into evening, stretching golden fingers across the walls of Groningham's cottages and catching in the dew-laced threads of spiderwebs at dawn. Birds sang from rooftops and hedgerows, and everywhere the scent of new things: grass, rain, flowers, and food. It was not feast nor famine now. It was the between time, abundant but quietly so. In her garden, Rotger picked broad beans one by one, snapping them into a wicker basket. She hummed softly as she worked, not from joy exactly, but from relief. Each pod held a smooth treasure of soft green kernels. These she would boil gently, then toss with oil pressed from walnuts, and serve with stewed onions and fresh flatbread, torn and used to scoop the beans from the bowl. She called her children in with a quiet whistle. They came muddy-kneed and bright-eyed, and they ate outside, sitting cross-legged on the ground, chewing slowly with the kind of attention that only hunger shaped by memory could grant. In the far cottage near the woods, Mechtild had harvested her first strawberries. They were small and wild, deep red and sweet with a hint of sharpness. She crushed them into a rough compote, added them to a spoonful of thickened cream, and folded it into a dish of barley pudding made earlier that day. The grains were soft and slightly chewy, the cream cool and faintly sour, the berries vibrant. She ate with the door open, watching bees flit between nettles and violets. The pudding was gone before she realised how much she had savoured it. Toon had begun baking spiced loaves again. With better grain arriving from nearby estates, he mixed rye with ground coriander and aniseed, adding dried apple slices preserved from last autumn. The bread was dark and fragrant, not sweet in the way of luxuries, but aromatic, satisfying, something to be torn by hand and eaten with fingers still dusted with flour. He traded 3 loaves for a length of cloth and another for a small pot of gooseberry jam made by the carpenter's wife. That evening, he sliced a piece of his own bread and spread the jam thickly. The tartness hit his tongue first, then the warmth of spice followed. It made him close his eyes. At the monastery, Brother Elric and the other monks now ate from gardens heavy with herbs and lettuces. Their meals were still simple, barley beans and boiled greens, but they had flavour again and colour. On Sundays they added soft cheese and sour cherries, stewed gently with honey. The novices, new to these seasonal luxuries, said their prayers with fuller voices. Elric wrote in his book, "Peas and mint, cherries and milk, the rhythm returns, salt gives way to sweetness." Down by the stream, Martin had caught trout so plump they shimmered with gold. He smoked them lightly over alder, stuffed their bellies with fennel and garlic, and laid them on crisp leaves from the garden. He ate his with his fingers, licking the oil from his knuckles and sipping ale that had finally fermented properly in the warming weather. Janet and her mother prepared a stew of lentils and young carrots, stirring in chopped lovage and crushed sorrel at the end, just enough to bring brightness to the dish. With it they served pickled eggs preserved a month earlier in vinegar and herbs, and a small bowl of curdled milk, lightly salted and shaped into a pat. It was simple, but every bite seemed new. Not because it had never been eaten, but because now, at last, each flavour stood on its own. There was no need to cover spoilage, to disguise age, to hide. Even in the manor, Berth's cooking took on a different kind of energy. She roasted a hen with sage and green grapes, their sweetness mellowed by heat. She made tarts with goat's cheese and herbs, and stewed plums with black pepper and rosewater. The food was elegant, yes, but also rooted in the same cycles shared by every home in the village. What the land gave, what the season allowed, and what could be shaped by human hands. Lady Isabel commented on a dish of stewed cherries and lamb that it reminded her of summers in her youth. Berth only nodded, knowing well that taste was memory, and that memory was the truest seasoning. In the evenings, windows were left open. The smells of cooking drifted out, onions and thyme, leeks and vinegar, flatbread baked in clay ovens, honey slowly warming in pans. These were not smells of necessity anymore. They were smells of rhythm, of return. The tanner's apprentices, long silent at meals in winter, now sat beneath the linden tree behind their workshop, laughing as they dipped cold bread into a bowl of thickened ale and spiced lard. A boy passed around pickled beetroot, and another, with rare bravado, shared a pouch of dried cherries he'd saved since the market day. There was no declaration, no festival, no grand meal. But in every cottage, every hearth, the food of Groningham had changed. It was not merely nourishment anymore. It was choice. It was flavour. It was time turned edible. And as the sky stretched longer into twilight and the village slipped into evening with satisfied bellies and quiet hearts, the people knew, without needing to speak it, that this soft abundance would not last forever. But it was here now, and that was enough.